Okay, so the readings this week, particularly the Clapp and Bakker readings, focused on the international dimension of food security, assessing the impacts of dominant economic policies and evaluating various alternative approaches. So the first question that I thought we could address is, why has free trade and market liberalisation caused uneven distribution of global food security?
So in order to answer this interesting question, I think we need to first define what is meant by market liberalisation with respect to the food system. The Bakker reading this week explained how the economic order emerged after World War II, which suggested that more open trade would bring a more efficient agricultural system where increased food supplies would bring reduced food prices and increased access. So food insecurity was viewed as a problem of an unwillingness or incapacity to engage with the free market rather than a problem of the free market itself. Therefore, in order to gain food security, countries were encouraged to participate in an economic free market system where international institutions pushed for integration through SAPs. However, market liberalization resulted in the centralization of power and profit in the hands of a few, with monopolistic agricultural corporations, export-oriented monocultures, reduced tariffs and protection of corporate intellectual property. So even though these market liberalization policies did bring gains in efficiency, these weren't evenly distributed. And in many ways, this falls at the core of David Ricardo's principle of comparative advantage, suggesting that it creates an inherently uneven situation where some nations are locked into producing particular low-value goods while transnational corporations in already developed countries continue to take the lion's share of the benefits.
So yeah, this was seen in the 1994 Agreement on Agriculture, which brought market opening measures in developing countries whilst enabling developed countries to continue protectionist domestic support measures. This is especially seen because the US and EU domestic subsidies were for the most part exempt from cuts, whilst demanding market liberalisation in developing countries. I think this demonstrates how more developed and powerful nations were able to manipulate the legislature to focus on their economic and security interests, specifically through using the box method and peace clauses and tariff reduction formulas. This is similar to the work of Chang, who suggests that economic development pathway of now developed countries was entirely different from the now termed neoliberalist strategies, and gives rise to the idea of developed nations kicking away the metaphorical ladder, which they have used in order to achieve economic dominance by preventing developing nations from following the same path trajectory. This links to Marxist theories about a global capitalist order prevailing bourgeoisie class.
I think it's also important to consider the present day, as Clapp mentions how prevailing agricultural trade norms vary depending on global power dynamics. And this is because the issue of food security is not equal across developed and developing economies, but rather it is a balance of priorities. So where developed nations seek to advance markets, developing nations are preoccupied with food security concerns. And this appears to change depending on global power dynamics. For example, after the Cold War, the US dominated global power and spearheaded free trade initiatives, whereas now the G22 and G30 suggest a more multipolar power dynamic, which is led by emerging economies such as India, who advocate for increasing market conditions for farmers in the developing world. Despite this, there is a delay behind this shift in attitudes and change to the international agenda. For example, the Doha round appeared to be an international shift in attitudes towards special differential treatment.
India can be used as an interesting case study within this context. India previously threatened to withdraw from their trade facilitation agreements if demands for the SSM for farmers were not met. However, there's been a disparity between attitudes and actions, which is evident when looking at India's current policies to loosen their protectionist policies, indicating a state push towards economic liberalization, for example, through the withdrawal of state support and the opening up of the economy. Farmers have become concerned that they would not be able to compete with these food prices, and since November 2020, farmers in Delhi began protesting against the removal of guaranteed minimum prices for essential crops. These protests then became violent at the end of the month of January this year. And this raises an interesting issue, as the actions of the Indian state on the surface can be seen as acting against the wishes for farmers at a local level.
This leads nicely onto our next question of why might state-led sustainability be problematic and what are alternative solutions? So in his work, Scoones highlights how varied approaches to sustainability solutions can lead to debate due to unequal access to resources, as scarcity for one may mean abundance for another. Therefore, he encourages the reader to learn about responsible consumption practices, and central to this debate are ideas surrounding social justice. So what is the problem with state-led sustainability? Essentially, a transnational response is needed to achieve sustainability and development. And there are now global economic institutions such as the World Bank and IMF, which have gathered a large amount of influence. However, global action may not be able to be achieved because states essentially have different histories, capacities, and politics in relation to the environment. So it's difficult to achieve collaborative action. Another problem is that we're facing an environmental crisis, and we need to have a global focus on tackling energy issues and climate change. However, the cost of sustainable solutions can be very high, and some states will not have the appropriate infrastructure in place to implement sustainability solutions and have other national priorities.
Yeah, so I think with these state-led problems in mind, we can think of alternative solutions which are offered in the Scoones reading, such as market-led transformations. So these market-led transformations aim to establish the right prices to conserve, protect, and assure sustainability, moving towards what's called a green economy. So in Bakker's 2010 discussion of green neoliberalism, she highlights how these markets have been deployed to simultaneously pursue goals of economic growth, efficiency, and environmental conservation. This can be traced to the 1950s eco-modernist approach, which assumed that advances in science, technology, and design could help to fix the environmental, economic, and social contradictions which are produced by capitalism, here simultaneously protecting the environment and promoting growth. However, on the flip side, opponents to this market-led approach reject these approaches, suggesting that they're more like greenwashing, as they appropriate environmental commons for the private profit. And therefore, they actually deepen social and environmental inequalities as they continue a path towards uneven growth and fail to address the power relations which created the sustainability crisis that we're seeing now in the first place.
So technology-led transformations is another alternative solution, and techno-optimists have argued that science, technology, and innovation would release us from our environmental limits. In this way, sustainability and technology are closely entwined, and the transition town movement in the UK is a key example of how low-carbon technologies are integrated with architecture to restructure our urban environments for sustainability. Peter Taylor explores the transition initiative that aims to promote small towns as prime units of transition, urging local communities to change their way by creating a more resilient place to live that promotes the localization of economic processes. This prompts us with the question, how can this be made compatible in a world of large cities? Technology doesn't pretend to be the sole solution to sustainability. Instead, a combination of responses is needed on an international, national, and local level.
Yeah, so I think the only response we haven't mentioned yet is system-led transformations, which can intersect with state and market-led transformations. They are community-based natural resource management solutions, and they're advocated because it's supposed that they become institutionally embedded in the local community over time. I think a good example of this is the Extinction Rebellion movement, which obviously started at a local level, but it also shows the intersectionality because it now has an international community, and it is a registered NGO, which is trying to hold both governments and market leaders to account.
Yeah, so thinking about these alternative approaches to sustainability, I began to think about the next question, which was looking at why we need to consider ideas of justice and equality when addressing food security. Here, thinking about the emergence of food sovereignty approaches. So first, it's good to consider the Raj Patel reading, which explores how the definitions of food security have changed over time, initially focusing on people having access to adequate food supplies and being protected from market fluctuations in food prices, and now being a much more holistic definition, which thinks about food security as a social justice issue. So this idea was also talked about in the Bakker reading, which argues that to achieve sustainability and food security, we have to move beyond this politics, which is only driven by capital accumulation and increasing profit, instead shifting our focus towards issues of justice, which are really at the heart of delivering food security. So here we need to develop more comprehensive solutions which prioritize social justice and environmental sustainability. Again, this really links to the Amrita Sen reading, which touches on the inextricable connection between food and freedom.
Schoons then reiterates this idea, arguing that for food security to be successful, it must be achieved within the boundaries of a social justice floor and an ecological ceiling, prioritizing basic human rights as well as the rights of nature. Clapp then explores this contention and highlights how the global food system grapples with the dual narratives of production-focused trade liberalization, the acknowledgement that food is different to other commodities, and that access should be seen as the first and foremost as a human right. This debate can be seen in the barley round of the WTO negotiations, where India and the G33 countries demanded the right to protectionist and interventionist policies.
Yeah, I also noticed this argument in the Raj reading, as Sadie mentioned, which argues that we need to frame food security as a human right, one that requires tangible assurance and legal guarantees. This protection is what eventually emerged in the Sustainable Development Goals. Both eradicating global poverty and achieving food security are the first and second goals, and these goals are agreed upon by the 193 members of the United Nations. The intersectionality of the goals, and through describing them as a global project, demonstrates how there is an interdependency of the goals as well as a global recognition for the importance of this project. Therefore, in order to achieve food security and food sovereignty, we must prioritise developing a more egalitarian and democratic society in which the distorting effects of neoliberal economics, as well as sexism, racism, and class power, have been eradicated. Considerations of social justice must therefore be primary when pursuing food security.
So another way in which social justice has been incorporated into food security approaches can be seen in the food sovereignty movement led primarily by the La Via Campesina peasant organization, which emerged in response to the widespread suffering of small-scale farmers at the hands of SAPs. They pushed the food security movement towards ideas of food sovereignty, which prioritizes solidarity and unity among small-scale farmers, as well as social values of gender equality, social justice, and equal distribution of lands and seeds. This approach of food sovereignty urges us to place justice principles at the heart of food security policies. And this is shown in the Bakker reading when he gives an example of a group based in southern Mexico who mobilized in response to the negative impacts of NAFTA's neoliberal policies on rural populations.
So whilst food aid is often seen as a solution to the social issues of food security, it is not without problems. And the most striking question I was left with was, why might food aid actually worsen these problems of food insecurity? So traditional food aid programs were based on the assumption that declines in food availability cause food insecurity. Following this reasoning, food aid can, when well managed, be an important instrument for addressing these issues, but it can also be detrimental to those objectives if it's not properly managed, leading to market distortions and overdependencies, or if the humanitarian or poverty-reducing goals of food aid are used as a bargaining chip for alternative objectives. And this is exactly what history has shown, since food aid has become increasingly entwined in the broader international political disputes, creating a grey area between food aid and food security. And in 2004, when Canada and Australia reduced their food aid policies as a way to gain clout in the WTO negotiations, this can be used as an example.
However, it is interesting to consider Clapp's argument that food aid cannot be ruled out entirely, as it is necessary for humanitarian responses. When populations are caught in a conflict, they risk becoming refugees or internally displaced, lacking both food and the cash necessary to procure it. It is important to note that the impacts of food aid depend fundamentally on successfulness of food aid targeting, e.g. the timing. Bakker argues for food aid to be most effective, it should arrive prior to the harvest period, as if food aid were to coincide with the recipient country's harvest. It wouldn't add to consumption, but it would replace it. So foreign food will distort the local markets and push farmers off their land, making households more vulnerable to food insecurities. And an example of this was Somalia in 2000.
Yeah, so considering this question about food aid, I think it's important to relate it to the context of COVID-19, which has again exposed the apparent need for food aid to be accurately and effectively targeted. So this is ideas explored in Wilson's forthcoming piece, which exposes the fragility of our global food system and looks at how COVID-19 has brought a crisis of food security to the global north and the south. This can be seen in the recent scandal in the UK when the government implemented food packages, as seen on the screen, to support children who are missing free school meals. These packages were poorly organized and consisted of meager rations, and that led to scandal across social media. And hopefully this experience of food insecurity in the global north can help us to think more critically about the need to provide food aid in a more sustainable and just manner, and building a stronger moral connection between the global north and the south.
Yeah, so I think if we're going to summarize all those arguments, then in theory, if correctly distributed to who needs it and what moment in time, food aid should improve food security. But in reality, the targeting constraints of management have undermined food aid objectives as countries are met with problems of market distortion and falling further back into poverty and long-term dependency on food aid. Therefore, food aid needs to be seen as part of the solution and not the only resource. I suppose this is the whole point of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, since they have been elaborated and expanded since 2015, and the individual targets aim to ensure international cooperation towards a range of codependent sustainability initiatives simultaneously.